Anyone that starts sewing to try and save money on their clothes gets really sorely disappointed very quickly, right? We all know sewing is not cheap, but I actually think it can be. And so here is my top 6 ways to save money on sewing, basically so that you can spend more money on sewing. Welcome back, my sewing friends. It is always very delightful to see all your smiling faces here, and we actually do have a lot of new smiling faces here with us, so welcome. My name is Evelyn Wood and I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com, and there I help hundreds of members how to develop their sewing skills so you can get, well, basically so you can make the clothes that you really dream of. So hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't already. One of the things that we all realize really quickly in sewing is that it is not necessarily cheap. You go to the fabric store and you get the fabric, the buttons, the zips, the hooks and eyes, the pattern. All of a sudden, wow, right? It can really add up. That is generally not the way that I collect all of my sewing supplies. I've developed different ways and systems of doing things to save money and be a little bit more sustainable as well. So these are my top 6 ways to save money on sewing. Now, thrifting and buying secondhand is a theme over all of these. I haven't actually put it as a separate thing because these are ways of thinking, ways of shopping for our sewing supplies that are just not go to the big fabric store and buy your fabric off the roll and buy your pattern. These are other ways to do it to save some money because it can be really quite cheap and economical when you really know how to do it. So thrifting follows a theme over all of these, not only to save money, but is a great sustainable way to get all of our, actually anything in life, let alone just our sewing supplies. Okay, first one. Salvage. So salvage all of the, often it's called hardware and haberdashery basically, from existing clothes. So when you go to the thrift store and you see those $5 filler bag type areas or garage sales, yard sales, and they have just like next to nothing clothing, what can you pull off those clothing to salvage? I mean, for example, have you seen the price of a brand new pack of buttons lately? Yeah, I mean, it's like $10 for 3 buttons. Are you kidding? That adds up so quickly. So things like buttons are a really great one to pull off existing clothing, put into your sewing room and use those. Hooks and eyes, zips even. You can get them from next to nothing. Like fill a bag for $5, you can get so many zips, so many buttons, hooks and eyes in there. It's not funny. Also think like the trims. Can you unpick trims to use on your garments? Tassels, maybe there's different, just really look at those garments and what pieces could you pull off those for, you know, next to nothing and add them to your either stash or use on your project. Also think of the fabric in the salvaging. Maybe you could use certain different fabrics for facing pieces or little trims or little bits and pieces, contrast pieces as well. So what can you salvage from pre-made garments already in a nice, you know, filler bag for $5 type situation that you can use? Salvaging hardware is just one of the great ways to save money on your sewing, because those are one of the things that add up so quickly to the price tag on if you just go to the shop and buy those. So that is definitely number 1. The next is to set a monthly budget rather than a per project budget. So this, I mean, let's face it, some projects are really big, some projects are small, sometimes you find fabric cheap, sometimes it's more expensive, sometimes there's so many variables per project. So when you set yourself a monthly budget, it kind of starts allowing you to buy things cheaply as you see them, and it's fluid. So a project might last 2 months, and so you can start using that money to buy whatever it is that you need at that time, whether it's for that project, for the next one, bits and pieces as you find them, get them when you find them cheap, and allow your budget money to be spent per month rather than per project, because per project is so variable, but per month you can start to really limit that, and it allows you more freedom to start collecting different things as you find them, rather than just going out and making this project and you have to get all of those things all together at once. I like this sort of way of thinking about using your budget money per month rather than per project definitely helps me save money, because it allows you to start doing my next tip is to thrift a stash or just collect a stash. So as you know, I've made several videos on thrifting sewing supplies, what you can find at the thrift store. And so I've been doing this my whole life, of course, over the many years. I have actually collected quite a stash of sewing supplies, so I thrift them for next to nothing. When I find them, I collect them, and then I sew from my stash. That is how I operate and work. So it allows me to buy all the things that I need and like, fabric, trims, zips, threads, patterns, all these types of things, buttons that we need. I thrift them when I find them for honestly next to nothing sometimes, and keep them in my stash. And then when I'm sewing, I sew from my stash in that way. That's what really has worked for me. And so obviously the monthly budget allows you to start collecting a stash as you need it, and sort of helps facilitate that thrifting of a stash, because that is, you need to buy, if you want to buy cheap, you can't just go out looking for specific things. You let the cheap things, the great bargains find you. And I do love a great bargain thrifting. That's one of my favorite things to do. You know this. And fabric is everywhere. So don't just think that you need to go to the big fabric store and buy a fabric off a roll. Fabric is everywhere when you really start looking for it. One of my favorite things to use is bed sheets, for example. Maybe they're in your own closet, maybe you thrift them, maybe your neighbor has some old bed sheets. So you can use them they're the perfect toiles and mock-ups, practice pieces, of course, absolutely, that's what you should 100% use. And well, there's great vintage sheets out there that are in beautiful little prints and designs that you can use as actual fabric. And particularly when you first start as well, because we all know it doesn't take long before, you get to your third project, you look back at your first one and think, oh, what was I doing then? So it allows you to really just get in, practice, dive headfirst and not be worried about that you're wasting money on fabric. So use those bed sheets. You can find fabric in tablecloths as well. When you go to the thrift store, don't just go to the fabric section. The bedding, the linen, the tablecloths, think lace doilies. Often they have fabric sections and even remnants. So you can use those remnants. Maybe you find a great linen or a great contrast fabric to use for collars, cuffs, and different contrast pieces. You can find scraps, remnants of great fabrics for that. So think outside the box. Also really check your local classified ads. So many people just get rid of their old sewing stash, and fabrics, they're always there. So check your local classifieds for estate sales, people getting rid of fabric stashes. And now with all of these, you don't just go once or look once and think, oh, there wasn't any in there. It's whenever you buy secondhand like this, it's a case of you try 10 times and you get nothing, and that 10th time you do get lucky. So it's a constant thing that you're always keep looking and searching, and there will something come up eventually. Also things, silk saris on Etsy. There's fabric everywhere that you can get it from that is not just going to the fabric store and buying it off the roll. So keep your eyes open for what can you use for fabric everywhere, because when you start looking, you'll find it everywhere. Measuring your pattern layout before you actually buy fabric is a wonderful way to save fabric. We all know those layouts on the patterns are just, well, they're a guideline, right? It's a guideline. I've made videos on how to actually make your own layouts, or the rules that you need to follow in order to create your own layout. So measuring all this before you buy your fabric is great. Obviously I sew from my stash, so this isn't necessarily how I operate all of the time. But so what I mean is we often even have different widths than what is labeled on the pattern envelope, of course, right? We might have a different fabric of a different width, and so it requires a different amount of fabric. So what I suggest is to either get fabric that you already have in the same width, or you can actually just like pretend that you have fabric, measure it out on your table. So fold it in half like you normally would, lay it out, and then put all your pattern pieces on, work out your layout, take pictures of that layout or so that you can remember what you did, and then measure out exactly how much fabric you will need in that exact width of fabric. And then you can go buy it, so you're not buying extra that you don't need, or just to save on waste is a great way to save money, is by only really measuring out those fabric layouts and making it work the best for you. Of course, planning. The more you plan, I think like the more time you spend planning, the less time you plan, the less time you spend unpicking things or undoing things or wasting things. So plan out your projects. So plan ahead. What kind of things do you want to make? That way you can actually have a hit list of things to buy. Make yourself a hit list. So what do you need for the certain project? Do you need a certain color zip? Do you need a certain color thread? And you can write this down and keep it on your hit list. So when you go thrifting and you go to all these different places to sort of look for these cheaper sewing supplies, you have your list that you can always refer to find the things you need. What do you need for your stash? Plan. What things do you want to help build your stash? What do you always start sewing and you think, I don't have this or I don't have that? Write those things down as a hit list for your stash so you know what to look for. So plan ahead of everything. And of course for each project, how much you need so you're not buying extra buttons, so you get only exactly what you need, only the exact amount of fabric that you need. Plan out everything. More time planning and making lists of things, you'll definitely save yourself money rather than just randomly buying lots of different things. But that can mean by planning to build your stash too, just like I do. So on that note, what works for me the best? Well, over the years, I have my own system that works for me in my own personal style. So I don't think all of these are going to apply for all of us because we have different styles of just our personalities, how we like to do things. So for me, I like to thrift everything and get it for next to nothing. I love a good bargain. I love the treasure hunt, and I love vintage and unusual things that you can only really find secondhand. And sustainability is quite important to me and is useful to buy secondhand clothes rather than new on sewing supplies and everything. So I like to thrift everything for next to nothing, and I build up a stash. And then I sew from my stash. So when I want to sew, I look into my stash and I look around me for my inspiration on what I want to use. I piece together the fabrics, the buttons, the zips, and I use everything from my stash and I sew that way. I spend money on education. So learning and things like bed sheets and toiles, I would spend more money on to save money on making mistakes on actual fashion fabric. So there's less mistakes. So that has kind of what has worked for me in my process. Might be a little bit different for you. So I would love to hear below, what is your system? What is your best ways to save money on sewing? Because we all want to hear the tips on how we can save money on sewing so we can all spend more money on our favorite hobby, sewing, of course. Thank you very much for watching. Do check the description box below because there are a bunch of other videos there that I know will really, really help you out. So until next time, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Bye.